Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and today's contract tip has to do with how to properly fill out a termination and release agreement. So let me share my screen and we'll go over the forms together. So the first form we are going to go over is the GAR form, Georgia Association of Realtors, and it is the unilateral notice to terminate purchase and sale agreement and proposed disbursement of earnest money. And this is GAR form F522. F522. Now, unfortunately, GAR put these two separate issues on one form, but these are two separate contractual issues. The termination of a contract is one issue, and the disbursement of the earnest money per that contract is a completely separate contractual issue. A termination of an agreement is unilateral, meaning you only need one party's signature. Now, any party may terminate a contract. The issue is, did that party terminate by default, or did that party terminate by an unexpired contingency? And based on that has to do with the disbursement of the earnest money. But again, this is unilateral, so it means you only need one party's signature, and that's why it has the "or" right here. So how you would fill this out is you give the date of the notice, the buyer's name and the seller's name, the property address. Now, you are going to complete, is it the buyer who is terminating the contract or the seller who is terminating the contract? And then you simply fill out this reason, check one of these boxes. So for example, if a buyer is terminating and they are terminating within their due diligence period that has not yet expired, all you need to do is check this box that says buyer's right to terminate during the due diligence period set forth in the agreement. You do not need a reason. You don't need to say it's because of the inspection or zoning or whatever reason. The seller has given the buyer the right to terminate for any or no reason. So all you complete is buyer's right to terminate during the due diligence period. Then you have your buyer sign it. Now, if the buyer is terminating under the financing contingency, then you would fill out B, for example, the failure of the following contingency to which this agreement is subject. And you would simply put financing contingency. So that's the B is where you would fill out for any other contractual contingency that the buyer and seller agreed to. So that would be, for example, financing contingency, appraisal contingency, sale or lease of a person's home contingency, so forth, or other. Then if there is a default, you would put the following, well, I'll come back to that in a second. For other lawful reason, that is not further explanation on why a buyer is terminating under due diligence or why a buyer is terminating under the contingency. That is other lawful reason. An example of that would be, for example, in the purchase and sale agreement, it does say that the buyer has the right to examine the title. If they find an issue with the title, they have to give notice to the seller, and then the seller has the right to cure the title by closing or terminate. So that would be, or then the buyer can terminate. So that would be other lawful reason. Another time you would put other lawful reason is, let's say, for example, that a buyer or a seller, one of the parties, simply does not show up to closing. In that instance, you would wait until the day after closing, and then you would fill out other lawful reasons. So let's say the buyer just fails to show up to closing. Then in that situation, for example, you would fill out the seller is terminating the contract because the closing date has come and gone and it didn't close. So the following day, it would be other lawful reason, buyer failed to show up for closing, and then one of the parties would sign it. So again, the termination of a contract can be done by any party, but depending on which party terminates is going to be if they terminated by default or if they terminated by, that would be under the default. That would be the buyer, the following default in this agreement, buyer failed to show up for closing. So other lawful reason, for example, would be something else allowed for in the contingency. In the contract. Then, under the proposed disbursement of earnest money, the party unilaterally terminating this agreement proposes that the earnest money and all other funds currently being held by the broker holder, collectively earnest money, shall be dispersed as follows. And all you put in here is the amount of the earnest money and the party's name who you are proposing gets the earnest money. Now, this could be the whole amount of earnest money that the holder is holding. For example, $5,000 to buyer John and Jane Doe. Or the parties can choose to divide up the money. So it could be $3,000 to buyer Jane Doe and $2,000 to seller Jolly Roger. Whatever the parties agree to is what you write out here. But this is going to be the amount of the earnest money and the buyer's name or the seller's name, whomever the parties agree. Now, down here you have an and this has to be agreement. So whereas a termination of a contract is unilateral, in order for the holder to disperse the earnest money, the holder must have agreement, meaning we must have the buyer and the seller's signature agreeing on the disbursement of the earnest money. This is also in keeping with license law, which is GREC Rule 520-1-.08 under managing trust accounts and trust funds. Under disbursements 3B4, it says that the holder may disperse earnest money upon securing a written agreement which is signed by all parties having an interest in the trust funds and is separate from the contract which directs the broker to hold the funds. So, for example, let's say a buyer terminates the contract clearly within their due diligence time frame. Just because they do that, if we do not get the seller's signature on this, we cannot disperse those funds simply from the contract itself. Based on license law, we must have written agreement in a document separate from the document that directed us to hold the funds. Well, the contract is the document that directed us to hold the funds. So we need their signature on here. Now, there is another GAR form that is available to you that is called a mutual agreement to terminate purchase and sale agreement and disperse the earnest money. In this is a mutual, meaning both parties, agreement to terminate. So in this form, you are required to have both buyer and seller signature. This, in essence, is almost like an out-of-court settlement agreement if there was or even if there was not an issue. So this has language where everybody agrees to terminate, and it also addresses all the funds to be dispersed per the termination. So, for example, if the party, whichever party is terminating, if there is money owed or agreed upon to pay the selling broker or the listing broker, then that amount is spelled out here. Amount paid by seller to the selling broker under the agreement, amount paid by buyer to the selling broker, amount paid by seller to the listing broker, amount paid by buyer to the buyer to the listing broker, seller to the listing broker. And then we have the earnest money. And again, the earnest money can be divided up in whole or partial payments, depending on what the parties agree to. So that gets directed there. And then this form does, since it's a mutual agreement, you do need both buyer and seller signature. Additionally, there is the hold harmless language in this mutual agreement to terminate the purchase and sale agreement and disperse the earnest money. And that language is contained right here. Upon the happening of these events, buyer and seller further agree to release each other and all real estate brokerage firms, brokers, and their affiliated licensees involved in the transaction reflected in the above agreement, each of whom shall express third-party beneficiary from any and all claims, causes of actions, damages, so forth and so on. So again, this is a good form to use to just have everybody indicate that there is a mutual release. So not only do the buyer and the seller sign this one, but the brokers sign this form as well. Now, if you are binding on the RE forms contract, then in the RE forms contract, there are two separate forms. RE, this is RE, 263, and this is the termination. This is notice to withdraw or terminate. So when it says to withdraw the unaccepted offer or counteroffer, that is in the process of negotiation. If a party decides to withdraw their last counteroffer, then you would withdraw that. But if you are already binding, then you will already have an accepted contract with the acceptance date, and the RE forms packages use the term acceptance date to indicate the binding agreement date, and you are terminating the contract. You would write out the reason for the termination, and then again, termination is notice. Notice is unilateral, so you are going to have either the buyer or the seller sign the termination. Then you are going to also use a separate RE form, and this is RE 212, agreement to disperse trust funds. And again, agreement indicates more than one person. So you are going to fill out, this is agreement to disperse trust funds, earnest money, acceptance date, location of the property for purchase and sale agreement, the trust funds being held by, you name the holder of the earnest money, the amount of money payable to, and that would be either the buyer's name or the seller's name, at the following address. And this form, since it is agreement, you will need both the buyer's signature and the seller's signature. So again, if you are binding on the RE forms, you need two forms. You need the agreement to disperse trust funds and the actual notice to terminate. If you are on the GAR forms, then you will need just this one form, either the unilateral notice to terminate purchase and sale, terminate purchase and sale agreement and proposed disbursement of earnest money, or you can use the mutual agreement to terminate and purchase and sale and disbursement of earnest money. Now, I will let you know also, if, for example, a buyer terminates a contract within their due diligence period, or for whatever reason, and the buyer has not yet been contractually obligated to remit the earnest money, you still must address the proposed disbursement of earnest money in the release section. So, for example, let's go back to a purchase and sale agreement. For example, if you have that here in this section, if you have the earnest money shall be paid, whatever form, and you check B, X amount of dollars within, let's say here we have 5 days of the binding agreement date. And then let's say the buyer actually terminates on day 2 from the binding agreement date. Then even though the buyer has not yet remitted the funds, if earnest money is addressed in the creation of a contract, it must also be addressed in the termination of a contract. So you still have to address it here in the proposed disbursement of earnest money. So all you would write is buyer to retain earnest money, not yet remitted, per paragraph A7B of the purchase and sale agreement. So again, since it's addressed in the creation of a contract, you must also address it in the termination of a contract, regardless of the buyer's obligation to have even remitted the trust funds prior to the time they are actually terminating the contract. So I hope this contract tip helped you out. Thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. Oh, one more thing. The holder of the earnest money, more than likely, is also going to need the mailing address of the party that is getting the trust funds so that the holder can disperse the funds to that party. Most brokers will disperse it by bill pay or sending it in the mail. And so it's very important that the holder of the earnest money have the mailing address and contact information of the party that is receiving the earnest money. And you saw in the RE forms, there is a place for their address. GAR forms doesn't have that, but you are more than welcome to add it in. Regardless, make sure the holder knows where to send the funds. Now, thank you so much for watching. I'm Dana with Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.